everybody. Welcome to the second episode of He's a Porn Addict, Now What? The podcast. And I have to tell you, I am already very impressed by the amount of feedback we're getting and the questions. So please continue to keep those coming. We're going to address a way to deal with those questions at some point down the road. Josh, are you pretty happy with the first episode? And what have you been hearing?
Very happy. I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate everybody who recognizes just how serious porn addiction is and how it affects the partner. They always talk about in addiction, it's not just the person who's using or, we think about drugs or alcohol. Everybody around them gets sick. It's the same thing for pornography. Everybody around the person who has the porn addiction gets sick. And I think that this is a valuable resource because there's just not a lot of this stuff out there, especially coming from someone who was a former addict like myself and someone who was a licensed professional like yourself. I think the perspectives are being appreciated.
Okay, so hey, let's spin some gold today. So today's question, Josh is going to answer first. Is there a difference between pornography addiction and sex addiction? So take it away. Let's hear your answer first today.
As the former pornography addict, what I would say is that it's just my preference, but I don't like it when the term sex addiction is used to describe my pornography addiction. Let's be honest, when somebody says that celebrity just admitted to being a sex addict, do you think to yourself that the superstar is dealing with an appetite for pornography or an appetite for intercourse? I think intercourse too. I am not somebody who cheated on his partner, and while I know it will be said elsewhere in this book by both Tony and I, a pornography addiction does not mean that your partner was cheating on you in real life with another person sexually. I have met plenty of intercourse addicts, and just on the surface, they seem to crave adventure and danger far more than pornography addicts like me who crave control. I've always been the kind of overly cautious person who almost never seeks adventure or danger. Sitting in a room looking at pornography in the middle of the night, hoping nobody in the house would wake up, was about as daring as I would get. I'm not here to tell you that looking at pornography, talking to women in chat rooms, or the physical act of intercourse outside of your relationship are all on the same level. I've met women who consider pornography use to be as bad as cheating. This is one of those gray area situations you'll have to decide for yourself if you find the pornography use has escalated. Sex addiction, by default, has become the catch-all term. I find myself telling people that I went to sex addiction rehab in Texas in 2015, despite the fact I think only 2 out of a dozen or so in the program actually had intercourse addictions. If statistics continue to skew in the current direction, there are going to be far more porn addicts than intercourse addicts in the world, and maybe then we'll start to get separate billing. I hope that the World Health Organization's recognition of sexual impulse disorder in mid-2018 will also move us in a direction of no longer lumping sex addicts and porn addicts together. As a former addict, I see a big difference, and I believe my wife does too. What's your take, Tony?
Oh man, I can't wait to talk about your take. So let me read mine. So what I, as the mental health professional, said is similar to the answer to the first question. This one comes back to labels and whether or not they are relevant. To be clear, until recently, there wasn't anything in either the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-4, or the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases that talked about sexual addiction or pornography addiction. Recently, the World Health Organization updated their International Classification of Diseases to include compulsive sexual behavior disorder as a mental health condition. So while this designation doesn't exactly meet the standard for addiction, it is definitely the strongest statement made by a body of experts in the field of sexual mental health. So then I say, let me share a very 30,000-foot view of what is happening to the brain when viewing pornography. When a man watches porn, his brain releases the feel-good drug dopamine. There's some fascinating research around what is called the Coolidge effect. The idea is that a male will mate with a receptive female once, and then he can experience a period where he is no longer interested in mating. However, if you bring another receptive female, he will then mate again, and so on until he, in essence, can no longer move, almost to the point of death. And this phenomenon has been observed in many different species in the animal kingdom. So what's happening is that the lower brain, or the reactionary brain, was designed to see a female who could possibly help the male bring forth kids to assist in tilling the land, harvesting food. So his brain pours out dopamine in order for him to hyper-focus on her, do whatever it takes to convince her that he's her man. But what research now shows is that the lower brain can't differentiate between the real woman in front of it or the pictures and videos it's seeing on a computer screen. So it will see another willing female and pour out dopamine saying, I got to get her too. But now with an endless supply of willing females, air quotes, the brain continues pouring out dopamine, basically creating a dopamine binge, which kills off many of the dopamine neuroreceptors in the brain. And this causes the brain to need to see more and do more to get that same rush, as there aren't as many dopamine receptors there to receive the feel-good drug. So the addict will start looking for more, sometimes shocking or twisted or taboo things to get the rush. And so sometimes this can lead people to experimenting with people outside of the relationship because they simply want that dopamine rush. But typically there is a period of time before pornography addiction becomes a full-blown sex addiction, where the individual will begin to explore what it would take to actually find a partner to have sex with. Sex addicts are not looking for a long-term relationship. They want the quick fix. I've had many clients in my office explaining the progression from just viewing pornography to exploring sites that will allow you to connect virtually with someone online, and then to ultimately finding ways to meet up to a real individual for the sole purpose of a sexual encounter. So whether it's only porn or both porn and sex, the outcome for the individual is the same. It's all about satiating the ever-growing desire and obtaining the requisite dopamine rush the user needs to feel satisfied. So much like the move from pictures in a magazine to videos or internet pornography to strip clubs to massage parlors to meeting up with an actual partner, the addict is looking for the next rush of dopamine and keeps needing to push the bar higher in order to feel sexually gratified. With other types of addictions, you often hear the term gateway. An example would be marijuana as a gateway drug to harder substances. While your partner may not be there yet and may never get there, I have seen too many situations where pornography was the gateway for acting out sexually. Anecdotally speaking, I've never had a sex addict that hadn't first been addicted to pornography, but I've also had clients with severe addictions to pornography that have never acted out sexually. And so this is where I love, Josh, that it's not that, oh my gosh, we have controversial, diametrically opposed answers. But what I so loved when I read your answer, and I didn't read these until I think what they call the galleys of the book. It was already ready to go. But I loved where you talked about that part where you say sitting in a room looking at pornography in the middle of the night, hoping nobody in the house would wake up, was as daring as I could get. And I agree that sex addiction, if you see even that progression that I'm laying out there, that at some point, if that person maybe has the tendency, the genetic makeup, the brain chemistry, whatever that looks like, to then seek that adventure or danger, I wonder if that's maybe where it starts to move over, because you're absolutely right. And so many people, if they say to me, oh, I would never reach out to somebody else. What, are you crazy? And for others, it is almost like that progression. So I don't know. I really like the way you put that in your answer.
And it's like you talk about with the Coolidge effect, and that's something that I mentioned to almost all of the clients who I help with pornography addiction now, is that this escalates. And I can tell you that my porn use escalated just like my alcohol escalated. At first, I got to the point where I could not drink enough beer to get drunk. So I had to move on to hard stuff. And I think that for those of us who are porn addicts, we understand that in that, let's say we watched very traditional one man, one woman pornography, and that was our go-to for a long time. Eventually, that can't be our go-to anymore because we just don't respond to it. So we get into more exotic scenarios. We get into more extreme pornography, just like someone with a gambling addiction goes from $20 a bet to $50 to $100. It's not, and I think a lot of people who aren't addicts don't understand, it's not that we're chasing a bigger high, a stronger high. We are chasing that first high. It's just that we do so much damage to ourselves that first high that we're going after, we now need so much more of this dopamine. So to get that, we have to go so much more extreme in our addictions.
Hey, I like that you said that too. I don't know if you're familiar with the book Atomic Habits by a guy named James Clear, but he talks about the dopamine hit starts becoming more about the anticipation of the event. And so the leading up to it, the chasing of it. And so that's where I do feel like, it becomes more about novelty, and that the act itself is not as satisfying. So then somebody then wants to find novelty again. And another quick thought before it jumps out of my head. So I often talk about the habit cycle. You've got a trigger, then you've got a thought, then you've got action. So the trigger can be whatever, and then that's going to lead to a thought of, I want to look at porn. And then the action is actually looking at porn. And often I think people that don't struggle with this, with any type of pornography or compulsive sexual behavior, assume that, trigger must be some hot girl walking by. But I say the number one trigger is opportunity. It's boredom and opportunity. And so sometimes I do wonder if A lot of the people that I work with, it moves into pure sexual addiction, or like what you're saying, intercourse addiction, are people that are in positions where that is the opportunity. Maybe they travel a lot. Maybe they're away. Maybe they're in positions where they are in front of people and they are dynamic. So people then come up to them. So sometimes I do feel like it ends up being this increasing thing of having the opportunity to act out in that way. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree with you 100%. And I'll tell you, one of the interesting things is when we originally wrote this book, TikTok was not really a thing out there. And now almost all of my clients will tell me, and I deal with mostly younger men and women in their early 20s, and TikTok is the number one thing that gets them going, whether they're watching in bed at the end of the night, whether they watch it to get up in the morning. They always start with just watching some videos. And for those of us who have seen TikTok, you start to see them and you start to see them. And then if you're liking them, pretty soon you're getting a softcore pornography feed coming right to you. And like you talked about with the Coolidge effect, I actually had a TikTok video that went viral about this, how that point of view pornography, where it's one of the actors holding the camera. If you can watch this kind of pornography every day and your brain is starting to tell you that, okay, well, I'm watching this on the screen and this is like they're performing on me. Well, when you are with your partner for the 500th time or the 1000th time, the Coolidge effect tells us you're not going to be as into them because you've got this endless stream of pornography coming at you with a different person every time. And if your brain cannot tell that the man or woman on the screen who's talking to you is not your partner, when you're with your partner, odds are you're not going to get the dopamine going. You're not going to get the oxytocin and the serotonin going. And that's when we see porn-induced erectile dysfunction. That's how that often gets caused. And that's the number one thing that I hear from partners is that he can go off and watch porn and he can function, but then when he's with me, he can't. And that's where a lot of those feelings of betrayal, a lot of those feelings of rejection, a lot of those feelings of being, am I not enough for him? Am I not pretty enough? Am I not good enough in bed? That's where a lot of this comes from. It comes from watching this type of pornography that's out there, the point of view pornography.
I love that you shared that. Before we wrap this one up today, I have to throw in there, I remember I've been doing the professional work around this for 15 years or so. And I remember being at the beginning of that phase where you started to hear there's a tale, and I don't know if it's an urban legend, but it was the concept around erectile dysfunction, and a group of medical professionals are at a conference, and then they just are talking openly during breaks about anybody else seeing 18 to 25-year-old men with erectile dysfunction, because that was not a thing in the past. And all of a sudden people kind of sharing notes and then realizing, okay, this is an epidemic. And it took a little bit for people to put the two and two together and realize that, okay, this is pornography induced. And I feel like that is something that I know old guys like myself had never even thought of anything like that. No. But now it's a really common thing.
Statistics suggest that when you and I were 20 years old, that the amount of erectile dysfunction that was happening was about 2 to 4%.
Okay, what is it now?
Now it's about 20 to 25%.
Wow.
So we've gone from 1 in 30 to 40 men having erectile dysfunction to 1 in 5 men having erectile dysfunction in only 25, 30 years. And you can't tell me that that's evolution. That's obviously some kind of outside influence. And if it's not pornography, I can't imagine what it is.
No. And then, okay, so we're going to be giving all kinds of things like this in future episodes. Josh, we're going to have to figure out a way in future episodes to address this, because I could go for days. I do want to tell people that they're hearing this and they say, oh my gosh, that's me. I have the solutions. I know what we can do. I can help. But maybe we'll have to do that in a future episode. Josh, thank you so much for doing this project. I mean, we're changing lives, my friend. And so we will be back next week with episode 3.